All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the December Ivy Talk. This is our last talk of 2022. And this talk is in celebration of the life and work of Mr. Conley Greer and the many other African American Extension Service agents that work so hard in their communities. I'm Susie Farmer, the Education Director at Ivy Creek Natural Area and Historic Riverview Farm. It is my pleasure to welcome all of you all this evening. This talk is important because it not only helps us to expand our historic knowledge of this important part of our history, but it also helps to bring to light many unsung heroes. I am beyond excited to introduce our speaker this evening, Dr. Carmen Harris. I first read some of Dr. Harris's articles when I was in grad school and rediscovered her work as I have been researching the history of Riverview Farm. Dr. Harris is a professor of history at the University of South Carolina upstate. She teaches African American, U.S., Southern, and Latin American history. Her research and teaching interests include African American, Southern, and South Carolina history. Dr. Harris served a 6-year term as a member of the Board of Directors of the South Carolina Humanities Council and has served on the Membership Committee and Minority Committee of the Southern Historical Association. She has published several articles and book chapters on various subjects related to African Americans in agricultural extension programs. She has also done consulting, either research or speaking, sometimes both, on extension work for the Henry Louis Gates series, Finding Your Roots, for SR1 in Mississippi, Al Jazeera, and the just published Mississippi Black Farmers Would Love Some Help But Won't Be Caught Waiting by Daniel Dralinger. Did I say that right, Doctor? Okay. And that was in the USA Today papers. Dr. Harris, it is very much an honor to have you with us this evening. Before we get started, there's just a couple housekeeping items. This is being recorded and it will be posted to our website in the next few days. Please mute yourself if you have not done so. And please put all your awesome questions in the chat box and we will answer them at the end of the presentation. So now I will turn it over to Dr. Harris. Dr. Harris, thank you so much.
Thank you, and good evening. Thank you so much for having me. Thanks for the applause before I get anything done. I appreciate that very much. I'm going to start by telling you a little bit of my own personal story because I hope that'll help you understand how I got to this subject. I am the granddaughter on one side of my family of a sharecropper, and I often say that the only piece of ground he ever owned was the piece that he's buried in. On the other side of my family, there are textile workers, but also that's my grandfather, but his mother, my great-grandmother Mattie, was still alive when I was little. And they also farmed, and I don't know if farming was ever the primary occupation, certainly was before my grandfather became an adult, but they farmed on the side when I was little. They farmed cotton on rented land. They actually owned their home and they had lots of gardens, but they farmed on rented land as well. I remember my step-great-grandfather making me my own little jute bag so I could go out and pick cotton. And because I was so young and had no knowledge of the history of African Americans and cotton picking at the time, I thought it was fun. Whereas, a century earlier, a child my age would have had to been doing that for work. So I come from a rural background. So I went to Clemson University for my undergraduate degree in accounting and was recruited into a master's degree in history. I went that way because I started out, I wanted to be a journalist. My high school advisor persuaded me to be in engineering, which I was not good at. So I switched to accounting because my cousins were both in accounting and they were good at that. So I thought, well, maybe my family's good at that. I wasn't as bad at it as I was at engineering, but I wasn't great. And I was actually in a history course trying to raise my GPA to graduate. And I was asking questions that a couple of the professors found interesting. So one night they came up to me, asked me what my major was. And I said, accounting. They're like, do you like it? I said, not really. And they said, great, because we think you'd make a great lawyer or a great historian, and we can help you get into graduate school. So that's how I ended up in graduate school. And in graduate school, in one of my first courses, still at Clemson, my thesis advisor said, no one knows that there were Black people who were professional employees of Clemson in the early 1900s. So that was very surprising to me, because certainly on the campus, you would have had your custodial, and if you had dining help, those people would have all been African-American, just, menial type of labor. But I never imagined that there would be people who were professionals. And so that started me on this odyssey where I discovered Negro extension work. I wasn't like the first one to write about it. There have been, dissertations from people who were actually in that field. In the early 70s and 80s, there had also been authors who are in the historical field who were just beginning to write about this. One of the most notable was a guy named Earl William Crosby, who did kind of a South-wide dissertation on Black extension work. Another guy, Alan Jones, had done research in that field. I discovered them along the way after I discovered my topic, when I was actually looking for secondary sources. And so I started doing this research and learning about what is called Negro extension work. That's what it was called at the time. And it's pretty much been my occupation for the last 30 years. I wrote a master's thesis. The master's thesis was based on research in the Clemson archives, where they hadn't even organized their papers yet. South Carolina State, or it was called Colored Normal Industrial, Agricultural, and Mechanical College at the time that the Negro Extension Program began. And at the National Archives, my thesis advisor paid for a ticket. I had relatives who lived in DC, and so I went to DC and rode the bus every day for a week, going to the National Archives to tease out what I could get. What I found for my first, my master's thesis, was that I came to a conclusion that Negro extension work was a product of federal activism against Southern racism. And that was kind of always the dynamic of the way I had learned about the history of federal race relations as opposed to Southern race relations. So I had the white hat on the federal government. I'd intended to do this through 1970, but I ran out of time and I needed to go get a PhD. So I was going to pick up in 1930 and go to 1970 for my doctoral dissertation. But what happened then is, when I went back to the archives, I discovered this key book that illuminated what I thought about the white hat, black hat, federal Southern thing was actually not the case. So I felt an obligation to rewrite the first part of my master's thesis. So I ended up writing a 713-page tome that I hope someday to turn into 3 books about extension work. It's a multi-layer analysis. I kind of look at the national environment of extension work, what it was like for Black agents and that professionalism in South Carolina. And then I looked at the interaction between the agents and their clients. So it's like 3-level studies, and I'm going to make 3 books out of this. And I haven't gotten there yet, but that's kind of where I got started. One other tidbit before I actually get into what I want to talk about is why this became really meaningful to me. I started out talking about my sharecropper grandfather. And when I was doing some of this research, I came across this folder on World War II where they were rewarding families for growing food on their own land instead of, with the rationing and everything that was going on. And my grandfather was on this list to get a certificate. He didn't get gold, he got silver. And I just remember seeing it, and I sat there and just looked at it for a while, because the only place I'd ever seen his name was on his gravestone. He actually died before I was born, so I didn't even know him. And I just thought this was so awesome. And I guess maybe I'm a nerd. I made copies of this and gave it to all my aunts and uncles and my mom for Christmas, because I just thought that was just, for me, it proved his existence. And it also kind of validated my feelings about understanding how this work is important to the African American experience. Broadly, I will say that when we look at how extension work started and some of the debates around that, and I'll talk about that a little bit, it was envisioned by white Southerners as a way of social control, of making sure that African Americans on the farm were not market competitors to white farmers, but that they would be satisfied and they would be there and be that kind of pool of labor that whites needed for things like harvesting cotton or sugarcane or tobacco or whatever. But one of the things that these agents, these African American agents, they subverted that paradigm. And so what they actually did was to help these people think about their lives in a very different way, which is why when I'm going to start sharing my screen now, so you won't be seeing me anymore. If I can get this right, please let me know, Susie, if you don't see it. When I put in the subtitle, A Quest for Independence, that's why that subtitle is there, because that's the way I like to think about extension work, is that it's a quest for independence. So I'm going to just give you real talk, honestly. I thought this talk was tomorrow. So I was working on this, so it's going to be a little bit rough, but I'm just going to kind of talk you through some of the slides I was assembling, because one of the things I was trying to do is to make it more Virginia focused. I've never heard of Mr. Greer. It's kind of hard to find him in the historical record. As I said, there's not a lot written on Virginia extension work. And so I was trying to fill in some of those gaps, and I was not really able to fill them in as much as possible. But here are a few things I found. So the first thing you see up here is 1906, John Baptist Pierce, and he typically went by JB. Most African men would go by their African American men would go by their initials rather than their names, because oftentimes if whites knew their names, they would call them by their first names, but at the same time have the expectation that they would be called Mr. Pierce. Let's say if Pierce was the last name of a white man. He is one of two African Americans who became the first extension agents in the Southern states. The other is Thomas Campbell, who was headquartered at Tuskegee in Alabama. They were a part of what are called the Knapp Man, a man named Seaman A. Knapp, who had a variety of different professions before he became involved in extension work, which at the time was called demonstration work as well. So those terms were kind of interchangeable. He hired them as two men to do some kind of missionary agricultural work among African Americans. Now, I would say this was not an accident. Already by 1900, Hampton Institute, which I will call it the mother institution of Tuskegee, because Booker T. Washington attended Tuskegee. Founded Tuskegee, but attended Hampton, where he got his education. Those two had a lot of connections. And both of these institutions were already undertaking what one would call demonstration or extension work with African Americans who lived around the communities where each of these schools was located. And so you had this autonomous area of African American leadership in agriculture that by putting these two men on the payroll, it kind of co-opted that and took away some of that autonomy. Now, they are not federal employees at this time. At this time, the General Education Board, which is a John D. Rockefeller philanthropic organization, they were the ones who were actually paying for this kind of work. And what you can see here is that these two guys are appointed, and they get appointed over large service areas. So they become kind of supervisory agents for regions. So everything in the Carolinas and northward, you had Pierce over, everything, and I think Georgia as well. Everything from Alabama westward, Campbell would be over. And between 1907 and 1914, 1915, when the Smith-Lever Act is enacted and goes into effect, you had African-American men who were hired in these states, primarily in places they call the Black Belt, and it can be called the Black Belt because the population is overwhelmingly African-American, or it can be called the Black Belt because of the soil. Both of those things are often discussed. And they would hire agents in these areas to work with Black farmers. And what these agents were able to do at that time, they had complete autonomy up until they become part of this system. And so they're teaching skills about entrepreneurial type of skills would be the best way to describe that. So they're teaching, how to market, how to, expand your farming operations, different kinds of things like that. South Carolina, for example, had 7 agents who were African-American men before the Smith-Lever Act. And one of the things that becomes kind of a hallmark, and we'll talk about this a little bit more later, is the live-at-home method of being a self-sustaining farmer. And you can see that the practices of both Pierce in Virginia and Campbell are like this in many ways in trying to help African-American farmers and their families become more self-sustaining. And they want to be able to use that self-sustenance as a foundation for entrepreneurial and economic advancement. Now, the next thing you see here is the only events of the timeline I could find of Virginia Extension. There was a very short article on this on the Virginia Tech website, and their timeline really didn't add anything much more to this than that. And what you see in 1909 and 1910, when you see the reference to boys and girls clubs, and that's what they would have been called, these are the first actions of created in Virginia for white boys and white girls. They don't put the racial adjective when they mean, white is silently the norm. So the Boys Corn Club in 1909, which is probably 2 years behind South Carolina, and the Girls Tomato Club in 1910, or the Cannon Club, also behind South Carolina, but South Carolina started earlier that year, are the first clubs there. And most extension work actually did not start with adults, which is what we're going to be talking about. The first thing you had was what would eventually become 4-H. For the adults, what typically happened is that you might have someone's farm, and that person would be called a demonstrator. And so you would have this extension agent work with this farmer and say, I want you to institute these practices on your farm. And so that person would farm under the extension agent's direction, and then other neighbors would come around and look. What we're going to see later is that the extension agents are going to visit a lot of people's farms. So if you watch Green Acres, Mr. Kimball is actually a demonstration agent. I just brought him up in part because he's someone that, when I was doing my research the second time at the National Archives, I learned that agricultural extension agents hated because they thought he gave them a bad name. And so, but that's what it's going to ultimately become, is that you're going to visit all the farmers in your service area, offering them your services to help them improve their animal husbandry as well as their agricultural practices on their farm. This is an opportunity for men who don't go to college, and that's why it's extension. So these are people who are not part of the academic community. I think one of the books that was written about this, I think Rain Rasmussen wrote it, talked about taking the university to the people. So that's what extension work really is. So you have the start of that in 1910 for whites, but this is the era of Jim Crow. And so what you see is that the work for African Americans begins later. In 1913, Lizzie Jenkins becomes a demonstration agent for African American families, primarily focusing on the home. And you'll see this as well. There's a woman, I can't think of her last name. Her first name is Annie from Boley, Oklahoma, who was another one who was an early one. And so they were like the parallels for women of John Pierce and Thomas Campbell at that time. And so these canning clubs were some of the earliest opportunities that African Americans had to have any kind of experience with these types of services. As I was looking, I could not find a date for when the first African American man worked. Mr. Greer's dates of employment were 1918 to 1953. Which is a pretty long time. I think that's about 35 years. So you may not have had any African-American men agents until that year. And I kind of find that interesting because it's the reverse of what happened in South Carolina. So if we look at what happened after the Smith-Lever Act, and I'll come back to the 1918 in a second. If we look at what happened with the Smith-Lever Act, this was an act passed in 1914. It was one that was really strongly advocated for by white Southerners. The sponsors of it was A. Frank Lever, or Asbury Francis Lever, who was a South Carolina congressman, and Senator Hoke Smith of Georgia. And I've not really found any direct evidence, but these African American men were professional employees. They were getting similar pay to white agents who were being paid by the General Education Board. And this is the era of Jim Crow. And so that is really something that was taboo. White Southerners had worked mightily from 1870 down to redemption in 1877, and long after that, to push African Americans out of any kind of relationship with the federal government. They wanted to interpose a white power structure between African Americans and that federal government, and they wanted to mediate any kind of resources or assistance that those African Americans might get from the federal government. And so my speculation is that what happens, because of the way the Smith-Lever Act debate went, was that they didn't want to have African American agents at all. Why do I say that? There is an enormous debate. And so the Smith-Lever Act, it was going to have these white demonstration agents, and the original provision made a statement about having Negro farmers work as demonstrators. And I described demonstrators to you earlier as not federal employees, but as people who have farms that the federal employees would visit and direct them on how to improve their farming practices. They might get $1 or $2 a year from the federal government, and all that would do is give them the franking privilege, which is allowing them to use government mail without paying postage. Well, the NAACP got wind of this, and many people don't know, but at that time, the NAACP was maybe about 5 years old. The majority of its leadership, with the exception of W.E.B. Du Bois, who was the editor of their published publication, The Crisis, they were white. And they used methods that white people used in government. So they had lawyers, they had lobbyists, and so they started lobbying Congress, and they reached out to allies outside the South. One of them was a senator, and I can't think of his name now, but one of them was a senator from Iowa. The other one, and I can think of this guy's first name, is Wesley. So one of them's name was Wesley, and one of them's name was Jones, I believe, from Washington State, to have them block the bill. And one of the things that I find very ironic about this is that they were fighting anti-Black racism that was in this bill, where at the same time, Washington, who was on the West Coast, where you had a lot of Asian immigration, was kind of trying to prohibit Asians from immigrating to the United States and things like that. So there was this protracted push. So what you had was the Southerners saying, we're not going to support this bill if you have, we can't have Negro agents in the South, this kind of stuff. You had also a lobbying campaign through informal channels, although the General Education Board was paying the salaries of these agents, and the Bureau of Plant Industry, which was in the Department of Agriculture, was actually managing it. By this time, Seaman Knapp is dead, and his son Bradford is his successor. And I don't know that he talked with people in other states, but I do have the back and forth conversation with what went on in South Carolina. And the plan in South Carolina was, we're going to fire all these Black agents, and we're going to have these groups of families as demonstrators. And then, the whole idea from that was, that didn't seem to be enough. So they upped the level of demonstrators, and it never really panned out. One of the things that they were reminded of was in South Carolina in 1890, there was actually a fight over federal agricultural disbursements. And this was because you had these acts called the Morrill Act. So there was a Morrill Act in 1862 that created white land-grant colleges. In 1890, there was a second Morrill Act that provided further funding for those colleges, but it said you could use the money for segregated colleges so long as the split was equitable. And in South Carolina, the majority of the population was Black, but most of the money was being directed to Clemson Agricultural College, which at that time was under construction. And the money actually got held up for a couple of years because the Secretary of the Interior, who was over the money, would not release it to South Carolina, saying that it's not equitable to give the minority of your population the lion's share of the money. So when the Smith-Lever Act came up, the same thing kind of came down. And one of the things that Bradford Knapp does is he talks about, you need to remember what happened in 1892. This might open up that whole can of worms. And not only will the Smith-Lever Fund maybe have to be split, we might have to go back and split this other Morrill Act of 1890 fund. And this was at a time where African Americans were still the majority in this state. And so what happens is you have this back and forth between the federal government. There's a long debate in Congress. Actually, I think Virginia Tech created a booklet of all of the debate over this issue. And so finally, the Southerners relented. But what happens under that is that the Southern states get to designate who is going to get the Smith-Lever money. And so they designate with consistency the white land-grant colleges. I think in Alabama, Tuskegee might have gotten its own specific disbursement, and maybe the same with Hampton and Virginia. But in other cases, all of that money went directly to the white land grant college, and you could only hire as many agents as they would be willing to pay for. And even with a lower salary, they weren't willing to pay for a lot of agents. And to make sure that no local whites were offended, they would require the local county to put up part of the money for the agent's salary before a Black agent could be placed. They did not make that requirement for the white extension service. So if you look all across the South, you'll see white extension agents just being all over the place much earlier than you see African-American agents. And you'll never find one state in the South where every county has a Black agent. And many times it was an either or proposition. So you either had an agricultural extension agent who would be a man, or a home demonstration agent who would be a woman, and it would be one or the other, but rarely both until you get probably around Great Depression, World War II, and in some cases with emergency funding, you might get more than one. And so what happened in South Carolina is that most of the agents who were already on the payroll under the General Education Board were continued, with the exception of one man who was a South Carolina native, but he had left South Carolina for a while, lived in Chicago, was a mail carrier in Chicago, fought in the Spanish-American War. Back in South Carolina, he was a realtor. So he had pretty much, I would say, too much confidence for whites in the state. And so he was kind of disposed of, but most of the rest of them were local people who understood the racial dynamics of South Carolina and were likely not to undermine those. And so they were kept. And you typically find that everywhere. They're looking for a certain type of African-American man to be an extension agent. So you've got to be the kind to know to take your hat off, to say yes, sir, and to a white man, probably not to make eye contact. And a lot of times what you have when you have Black extension agents is that they might be called upon to actually do a demonstration. So let's say, for example, they're inoculating hogs against some kind of disease. You might have the white agent out there giving the directions and the Black agent actually doing that kind of dirty work of wrestling down the pig and giving them shots and things like that. So it's a complex hierarchy. Part of that complex hierarchy is race. So when these agents are hired and they receive notification of their hiring, they typically get it from the U.S. Cooperative Extension Service, which was created by that Smith-Lever Act, and they will be told, your title is Negro Agricultural Extension Agent. Do not use anything other than that. So they could not sign J.B. Pierce extension agent. It would have to be J.B. Pierce or Conley Greer Negro extension agent. If they use the other, you could get a carpet call for that. That was pretty serious. So that's how it was structured, and the program remained for African Americans remained very small in the early part of the 20th century. If I don't have time before I'm off of this today, I will actually send Susie a table so that you can see what that growth looked like, because it was very small. So like I said, in South Carolina, up until World War I, most of the agents were men. And during World War I, with emergency funding, they hired 19 women to be emergency agents for like 3 months in the summer to work on food preservation. But given the fact that Mr. Greer started in 1918, I don't know, but I'm speculating that the reverse could have happened in Virginia, that these first Black male agents were hired as emergency agents during World War II, just like these African American women were in South Carolina. You didn't have to be educated, a college graduate to be an extension agent. I was reading some of the information before I got on here and noticed that some of these agents had only grammar school education, some only had high school. The preference in this document I was reading from the 1930s, by that time, they preferred that you have a baccalaureate degree. But if you didn't have a baccalaureate degree, they preferred you to have at least 3 years of college. And in this list that I was going through, where I found Mr. Greer's name, he's listed as a graduate of Virginia State College, which was a historically Black college founded in 1882. So I'm assuming he had 3 years because there was someone right under him who had graduated from Hampton, and it says BS Hampton University. He attends a special summer school at South Carolina State College in Orangeburg, South Carolina, another interesting South Carolina connection to this story in 1930. And this was kind of like a professional development thing over the summer. And you had lots of these kinds of schools being developed and offered. This one was actually offered by Julius Rosenwald. And so sometimes these agents ultimately did get a baccalaureate degree, but it might take them a long time of taking time off from work to do that. And as I said, he had a long professional career. So you're going to see that I lifted a couple of pictures from, they're not Susie's slides, but from their website that I'm going to use in here and talking about some things in a minute. But what I'm going to do now, these are some pictures that came from the Schomburg Library. They came from a variety of different places. So this is a corn club. As I said earlier, the first entree into extension work for either race was through children, through the boys and the girls. Because what was expected is that children were more malleable and they would be more likely to take direction than their parents would. But if the parents started seeing that their children were making some kind of success, then the parents might also get interested. So that's why the canning clubs for girls and the corn and pig clubs for boys as a way to try to interest their parents through getting the attention of the children. And I don't know if you can see him here. He's kind of blending into the corn with there's his hat. And this would have been the agent over here teaching him how to select the corn, which corn to put aside for next year for seed, and over time learning how to make a more hardy variety of corn. Now, this picture came from the Arkansas Encyclopedia. A couple of these guys are, this is an extension agent from Arkansas, H.C. Ray, who was an early one with his wife. But this is John Baptist Pierce, J.B. Pierce, who was that field agent for the South. And I think he was on the job, I want to say maybe he died in the late 40s or early 50s. So, I mean, this was a good job for African Americans. If you weren't a minister or a school teacher or a mortician or a doctor or the rare attorney, this was a good professional opportunity for college-educated Black men in the South when many fields would have been closed to them. And so, one of the things you'll notice when you look at these people is how well dressed and how professional they look and how they accord themselves, even though, as you saw with this, you're out in the dirt, you're out in the farm. But I think, it's something that was attractive for many people. And a lot of, Thomas Campbell talks about this, that when he went to Tuskegee, he came from a rural area and he didn't want to do anything with farming. And, so he was talking to George Washington Carver, and George Washington Carver said to him, why don't you get involved in agriculture? And he said, oh, that's great. And then he said, I found out it was farming, but he came to really enjoy that. And the other thing about these agents is, like the preachers and like the ministers and these other elite, they are part of the leadership elite in their communities. And so they have a lot of influence over agricultural people. So you saw the retirement notice that came came on in Susie's slideshow. So this kind of gives a biography of him, and it talks about some of his successes and some of the things that he did in his office. He worked with 4-H, for example. He had his office in Charlottesville, and says members of both races have expressed their regret at his retirement. However, in retirement, while residing at his beautiful and well-kept farm home, Riverview, near the famous old hydraulic mills with his family and some of his grandchildren, he says he will devote much of his time to continuing to practice those things he has been advising others to do during the past 35 years. And what we're going to see, and I think this is interesting, when I was looking to kind of gather information on this, I found Albemarle County, Virginia actually mentioned a couple of times in some of the federal publications, which suggests that people thought he was doing a great job. So this is Mr. Greer. Again, this is something else that you've already seen on your slideshow that Susie provided. But I think I might have found another picture of him, not the young picture that he had there, but a different one that we'll see in a second. This is from Southern Workman, which is an organ of Hampton University or Hampton Institute at that time. And this particular article from 1922 talks about an agricultural school meeting in which a district agent, and I don't know if this person is African American or not, most of the time the district agents for the state were white, and they kind of supervised everybody regardless of race. And Mr. C.G. Greer, county agent of Albemarle County, was held at Yancey Mills to give instruction about pruning fruit trees. 40 farmers attended. And one of the things you'll see about a lot of this is that the numbers of people oftentimes directly reached is not necessarily significant. But what happens when you kind of look at the ripple of that, where, you know, there's always this argument or expectation that people who do better farm practices and become more profitable, just like the children get the attention of their parents, these people would get the attention of their neighbors, and these neighbors would start practicing these kind of taking up these kind of practices as well. And so they talk about this, all present took part in pruning trees according to the rules that were given. Many interesting questions were discussed. All orchards visited were in fine condition and showed the effects of good care. The results of specialization in growing and cooperation and marketing in one crop could clearly be seen in the improved condition of Negro homes and farms in this district. Now, this in itself is very interesting, because when they talk about specialization, that's typically something they did not want African Americans to do. So like being owning an apple orchard or something like that with that kind of line of work would give you an opportunity to be entrepreneurial. So in looking at this, that I find a little bit surprising and how that works out. But I think, you know, what you can see here is that there is that community interest. Now, this is another picture I found. It's in the, I think, 10 years of Negro extension work, but I think it's also, I got this from the Schomburg, but it's in a bunch of different places online. The man back here in the red circle looks a little bit like it could be Mr. Greer. This is from 1926. This guy, I don't know if it is or not, looks like it could be George Washington Carver. And this looks like it is J.B. Pierce. So all of these people are from Virginia. And you can see that in 1926, most of the agents in Virginia are men. So I think 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, maybe 8, 9 women. So by that time you've flipped and you have a substantial number of men in Virginia who are working in extension work. One of the other things that needs to be noted, though, is that sometimes if you only have one agent in a county, you might have an extension agent who has been given information that might help women, not necessarily in home beautification, but maybe in home gardening or something like that. And sometimes women agents get information to take to the farmers in their county if there isn't an agricultural extension agent in that county. So, you have a pretty nice looking force here. I don't know how many people there are. I didn't count them. So hopefully while I've been talking, you've had time to count. But I think definitely that's Pierce. That looks like Carver. It looks very much like Carver, but there was no names associated with this. So I was unable to find a lot of that out. So what do they do? This is an example of what's called a movable school and the movable school is when you take exhibits out to the farmers rather than the farmers coming to the exhibit. And what you see here, it looks like a hog that's being inoculated against some kind of disease. I have no idea what it is. But you can see right here, a lot of times these early trucks were called Knapp agricultural trucks after Seaman A. Knapp. And this was something that was actually pioneered by African Americans. And then Knapp kind of took it over, and they did demonstration trains for whites, took the idea, not took it over, but demonstration trains for whites and things like that. But this was a way for these agricultural agents, the Black land grant colleges that are cooperating to actually bring things to the local area that people might otherwise not be able to see, as far as, seeing what does a good creamer look like if you're going to be making cream on your farm out of milk. What does sometimes you have like animals on it, livestock. What would a cow look like? I'm assuming that this pig was a local pig and not a pig that was brought in, but they would talk about things like the importance of fencing in your animals, different kinds of stuff like that. This is another example where you can just kind of get a look at what the extension agent's work would be like. The man standing here is the agent, and the one sitting on the plow with his mules there is obviously the farmer. And this is taught, and you see here in 1924, Negro farmers conducted 9,860 demonstrations with cowpeas, soybeans, and other leguminous forage, of which 8,358 were completed in total acreage of 54,000 plus. We're not really talking about a lot of numbers, and that's because of the small number of agents region-wide in the South. And it's also uneven in that regard because, like I said, you have to most of the time be in an area with a substantial Black population to benefit from this. And I was curious, Charlottesville is near the mountains. I don't know how many African Americans would have been in that community. I noticed from some of the stuff I was looking at before that there was a substantial free African American community in Charlottesville from before the Civil War. And also, if they're landowners, that was another thing that oftentimes dictated that they would rather have a Black agent in a place where most of the Blacks were landowners rather than sharecroppers, because they don't want sharecroppers to get any smart ideas about agricultural improvement. This is one about cultivating cotton. And you can tell if you look at this caption here, probably not written by a Black person, because it says the Negro is naturally a farmer and takes a keen interest in putting to use better practices learned at demonstration meetings. I mean, one of the things historically, even after the Civil War, there was that intent to consign African Americans to the land. The other thing I find interesting here, this person could be a white passing agent, but he could also be a white district agent or someone who comes out as well as part of this enterprise as far as overseeing it. All the guys back here without ties on are typically going to be farmers. This might be the Black agent over here. So it's just not clear who that guy is. This is another one where I guess the agent is African American, but very light, so maybe it's the same as the other guy. And they're talking about fattening hogs, and says Negro farmers desire helpful information on specific things that can be put to immediate use with noticeable results. In this respect, demonstration activities have rendered a valuable service in meeting their needs. So one of the main emphasis when extension work first started was something called the Live at Home program. And this is something that I actually cut from one of the extension annual reports at the time that described this program, because it was a program targeted specifically at African Americans. And it says it's generally advocated throughout the South and was essentially especially emphasized in Negro extension work. The basic features of this program were having a home garden, a farm flock of poultry, and a family cow, and the production of sufficient meat for the family use and of ample food and feed for family and livestock, including poultry. So what this is trying to do is to help the sharecropper not go deeper in debt by what's called furnishing, where they have to get loans at the company store to be able to fill in what they need to eat or drink. So living at home is supposed to be something, especially if you're not a sharecropper, it could help you keep your land. This is another image. This one is of a participant, a club boy, who looks kind of like a club man, Herschel Glenn of Rockdale, Georgia. It said he made over a profit of over $265 through club work in 1924. And so what you often see with this corn club, canning club, hog club, cow clubs, things like that, sometimes they're able to actually win prizes at fairs for their activities with extension work. Sometimes they're able to sell the surplus from extension work in that regard. Here is another, I think these are the two that I put in for their mention of Albemarle County. And I'm going to tell you something that I discovered tonight when I was doing this, is that they don't edit these often, because I found this exact same language and these exact same statistics in a 1923 version of this same report. So I'm like, it's really doubtful that that happens, but you can see here where they're talking about hay. Hay is a serious problem on the average cotton, peanut, or tobacco farm of the South. Many farmers have felt that they could buy hay cheaper than they could produce it, but the extension demonstration has disproved this. Albemarle County, Virginia, this would have been where Mr. Greer was, afforded a good example of production of hay for home use. 11 farmers conducted demonstrations, which yielded an average of 2 tons of hay per acre. This yield was due to the thorough preparation of seed bed and the use of stable manure, lime, and acid phosphate. As a result of these demonstrations, 35 other farmers were induced to grow hay for their stock. And then the home gardens. This is part of Live at Home. A total of 23,720 Negro men and women were enrolled in garden clubs, and 18,332 home garden demonstrations were carried through to completion, which means about 5,400 of these folks didn't finish. And, they have to keep records and stuff like that. So they learn record keeping. It requires literacy. And so sometimes people just couldn't keep up with that. They carried through completion by adults and reported on as an example to the respective communities of food and income to be derived from a well-planned and cultivated garden. Interest in home gardens was augmented by contests, meetings, tours, monthly garden letters, and other extension means throughout the year. The influence of this work was widespread. In Albemarle, Virginia, where 12 garden demonstrations were conducted, and the monthly letter and other means were used to arouse interest in the project. 187 Negro farm families were reported as having productive gardens from early spring until late fall. Similar interest in gardens were reported by most of the local agents. Now, local agents is another term they sometimes use for Negro agents. The white agent will be the county agent, and the Black agent will be the local agent, because they could only be active in the county where there were Black people. And even though Mr. Greer isn't mentioned in either one of these, it's likely that both of these are activities that he did. Virginia doesn't have their annual reports digitized online, so I wasn't able to get a lot about what he might have been doing as an individual in that regard. So what happens here, this is an example of probably the greatest level of success. So this is the home and buildings of a farmer, not in Albemarle, but in Gloucester County. I don't know exactly where that is, Virginia. An outstanding Negro farmer who attributes his unusual success to following the advice and suggestions of the Negro extension agent. And I mean, there are things about how to spend your money, all of that kind of stuff is part of this. And so when you look at what's going on in these examples I can show you, and you think about Mr. Greer's own home, you can even look and see that his home is likely having some of that kind of influence of this kind of extension work, because it becomes a model for others. And I think that's it. So I'm going to stop sharing, because I was supposed to leave about 30 minutes for questions, and I have 26. And where is Susie?
Trying to get my mouse to work so I can
come back. So am I supposed to read the questions, or are you going to let people just ask them, or what?
I usually read them.
Okay. Go ahead.
All righty. We have quite a bit going on. Let's see. One person asked, was Lizzie Jenkins and Annie white or Black?
Lizzie Jenkins is Black.
Okay.
Ella Agnew was white.
Okay. Dee Dee Smith said that Virginia State had lost accreditation when Mr. Greer attended, so he couldn't get a bachelor's degree.
Okay, I'll take your word for it, because I don't know.
And then
they got it back in 1923, but I think it was largely because they also had to be high schools, because there was no high school available, and so attendees very often came out of 8th grade. So that's what I understand. But I know
most of the HBCUs at that time would have been glorified high schools. So, for example, Benjamin Mays graduated from South Carolina State, which was the state Black land grant college in South Carolina. Then he went to Bowdoin, and they made him do another bachelor's degree, even though he was supposed to be a college graduate. So I wouldn't be surprised if they wouldn't. I would be surprised if they had accreditation at any point, because most of the time when you had these colleges, even though it had been around, and I would say if he's working, I don't know how old he was, but if he's working as an extension agent in 1918, he's probably close to 30, which would have meant that he was born, what,
around 83.
Yeah, 80. Okay, so 83.
Somewhere around
so
there.
he would have been at that. So that was like 1 year after that college opened. It opened in 1882.
Yeah.
So, by the time he would have been old enough to go at 1900, you still have kind of like that first generation born out of slavery. Nice. He would have been going in that first generation. How many people actually between 1882 and 1900 would have had the educational background to go to that school as a college in those first couple of decades?
Right, and it lost it in 1902. I mean, an interesting thing about Conley Greer too is he came to, it was Virginia Normal and Industrial Institute, when it lost its accreditation. They changed the name, but from North Carolina. So he's from North Carolina.
Yeah, I saw some things about some Conley Greers in North Carolina, including that he and his wife and their daughter Evangeline were visiting relatives in North Carolina.
Yeah.
So I was like, that's interesting.
And it was in the far northwest corner, which wasn't a huge, place of bondage, but, pre-Civil War. But anyway, yeah, it's, I always found that interesting that he came from North Carolina to Virginia to go to post whatever schooling Crumpler, North Carolina provided. Anyway, I'll let others have their
there
time.
would have been, I don't know how, when North Carolina A&T was founded, probably after 1890 with the Second Morrill Act.
Right.
But they had some good private schools like Shaw and St. Augustine. If you read the Delaney sisters book, Having Our Say, they talk about those schools. So there were some kind of in the Central Triangle area. They did have some good African-American schools that were created either by African-Americans or white missionary societies that would have been able to be accredited.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Oh, okay. Trying to go through the questions here. There's a lot of statements, so we're going to address the questions first. So one of the questions was, we've heard that Black extension agents were expected to own and work their own farms as demonstrators. Is that correct from what you understand, Dr. Harris?
I've never heard that. Alexa, stop. Alexa, stop. I don't know. So it must have sounded like you said the A word because it just started talking. I have not heard that. And, I'm trying to think about, the agents that I know of and whether or not they were, farmers. And I know the one that I was talking about that was dismissed, there was a lot of he was also a real estate agent trying to sell people farms. And that was one reason why they wanted to get rid of him. They were like, he's making too much money. He's got side businesses. But I have not really heard that, because a lot of times what would happen with an extension agent is that they wouldn't be necessarily from the community that they served. So, you could be born in Orangeburg, South Carolina, and they might send you to be an extension worker in, Clarendon County, and you would live there. You could probably be a farmer, but you don't have time to be a full-time farmer and a full-time agent. I'm sure they lived in rural communities and not in the city, but I don't know if they would have a farm like the people they were serving would have a farm. It
was definitely true of Conley Greer. I asked that question because it's part of our script, and I don't know why we think that. But Conley Greer, married Mary Carr Greer in 1914. So they already, and he was working for at least at some point for the Southern Aid Society. So as in insurance, but so there was 4 years that they were running that farm before he became an extension agent.
Right.
So he was already, I suppose, a farmer. But
a lot of these people would have had rural experience. If you're African American in the South, you're going to have, you're likely going to be a rural person, especially if you're interested in this job, so, and the other one I can think of that kind of doesn't fit that mold was one from Columbia, South Carolina. His name was J.E. Dixon. And he was from that area, but I never got a sense that he spent a lot of time doing his own farming. So, it probably varies, but I would say, are you supposed to be someone who could be a full-time farm operator? Definitely not. But certainly
we'll have to change our script.
But no, what you find about him, it varies. But, probably they would be expected at least to have a very nice home garden, You know, you would look around, one of the things they emphasize is beautification. So you would expect them to have a nice looking yard with plants and things like that. So you would go by that person's home, and that would look like a model rural community home, not necessarily like acres of corn or acres of cotton or something like that, that would need that person's attention outside their job, unless they had sons or somebody like that to actually do it.
Thank you for that information. The next question is, did successful Black farmers get violent opposition as a result of their success?
Some did. So if you look up, and I don't know, and you don't necessarily have to use extension service to be a successful Black farmer, because some had great intuition. So for example, there was a man named Anthony Crawford, and you may have heard about him, but you can just Google him online and do Anthony Crawford Equal Justice Initiative. He was one of the most prosperous farmers over near like Abbeville County, South Carolina. He had significant land, significant holdings. He went to Jenna's Cotton and Sellis cotton seed or something, and he got offered less than he thought it was worth. And as a successful man, he made it very clear that he was insulted by that. And white people came and got him, and they lynched him and killed him and ran his family out of the community. His family ended up in Illinois, and the white people took his land and farm. So yes, you could, you know, if you were successful, and you were Black, you also had to remember to be humble. You couldn't make a thing about being successful.
That's a sad story. The next question is in Albemarle County, the agent who took over for Mr. Greer when he retired was Mr. Jim Butler. And he became the county agent for both white and Black extension services when they integrated. Do you know of any other areas where this took place?
That is very rare, because the circumstance most of the time when there was integration and you had Black and white agents in the same county, regardless of the credentials of the African American agent, and even if they were better than the white agent, they would become the assistant or associate agent depending upon their education and how long they had worked, and the white agent would become the county agent. So the Black agents would be assistant county agent, associate county agent, but the white person would be the county agent. So if that happened in the 60s, that would be very surprising. The first time that happened in South Carolina was a woman in 1970, but there had been a lot of activism by the Black agents themselves and complaining about how that automatic demotion, and they were doing things like using the national teachers exam to justify paying Black agents who had many more years of experience, less work, less money than white agents who had fewer years of experience. So that if that happened in the 1960s, I am definitely surprised. If it happened in the 70s, and by that time you'd had some pushback and some legal cases, I wouldn't be surprised. I would be even less surprised if he became agent this way. The white agent who would have been county agent retired, and he was the last man standing. That would be something where it would typically happen more so than promoting a Black person over a white person in that period of transition where you have integration. Civil Rights Act of 1964. I'm reading Dee Dee Smith's question. I shouldn't have answered it, but I'm going to answer it since I saw it. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 said that this was that segregation was not legal. And Susie can refer you to my article, The Extension Service is Not an Integration Agency, where I talk about that. And there was a lot of pushback and resistance where the federal government kind of sympathized with the states and facilitated delay until there were threats of money being taken away. But that article will tell you. So that's why I say about 1970 in South Carolina, which is really my up close focus area, is the first place that I know about that. But I have in my documentation and in my dissertation that there was kind of like a South-wide strategy coordinated with the federal extension agents, the U.S. Cooperative Extension Service, to try to figure out ways to justify bureaucratically why this shouldn't take place. And in fact, the concept that I use to explain this is called bureaucratic racism, where you have these policies that are ostensibly colorblind, but you apply them in ways to achieve the outcome that you want. And that was what was really going on in the Extension Service in that period, starting with the Kennedy years and going forward to 1970. And that also is a year of Green versus New Kent County and schools in Virginia, where the Supreme Court said enough of this with all deliberate speed. And so some of those walls of segregation fell. But the other thing that happened, you know, I mentioned that Mr. Greer had a longevity as an agent. Many African-American agents had that same longevity because they didn't have other employment opportunities. And so the longer they waited and those people aged out into retirement, it meant that you didn't have that integration problem wasn't as uncomfortable, and that's putting it mildly. I can't think of the word I want to use. It wasn't that much of a problem for whites once most of these black agents started retiring because of their seniority and they were retirement age. And so it might make it easier to slide a few in.
That's interesting because Conley Greer retired in 53. He died in 56. And so Jim Butler did succeed him, and we say he went into an integrated system, but there might have been a lag there.
Yeah,
although Shenandoah National
until the 60s.
Yeah, Shenandoah National Park was forced to integrate in the 50s because it was a federal park. It was a national park, and I don't know whether federal support would have forced.
Yeah. Well, what happens with this, because of that hybrid, that federal state thing, that was one of the things that the federal government used for foot dragging, that, we give the money and the state sets the policies, so we can't really tell the state what to do. And so they had to wait for the policy to say they don't get the money from you if they don't change the policy. They had to wait for that to come up because the federal government had really been using that state federal cooperative partnership to kind of sit on their hands for decades in the face of a lot of rampant discrimination against African-American agents and African-American farmers.
Okay, I'm going to jump in here and move us along. The next question is, what research sources would you recommend checking to obtain additional information on Conley Greer's career as an extension service? And we do have we have stuff from him that's in the National Archives that he wrote, his reports. We have his reports.
But that would be what I would suggest. You had to go to the National Archives. Virginia Tech didn't have them.
That was before my time.
Okay. Yeah, so those narrative, they have narrative annual reports, and it just depends. So what I've typically found when I'm doing this research, I like doing the research on the women rather than the men, because the women like to write. And they, their stories have a lot of texture and things like that. And the men just write this much, like it's gonna pain them to write a lot. So if he was a prolific writer, you know, everybody had to do the statistical reports where you go in and put tick marks off on stuff so you can find out from the tick marks what he's doing with the tick marks. If he didn't write strong narratives, like usually when I, you know, trying to use men's reports in South Carolina, a lot of them just don't really write a lot to really kind of fill out what all of the things are going on. And men write differently for the reason that they're Black men. And Black women can write and say things that Black men should not write and say. And so a lot of times men are a lot less eloquent in what they put in their reports. And sometimes it's just like factual, you know, these things are going well, convince these demonstrators to adopt better farming practices. So even when there are words, they're not necessarily useful words. And that would be the only other place that I would say you could go is to those reports. And if you have those, you probably have everything, unless he has some personal diaries. If you can find more newspaper articles, because sometimes they might publish things in newspapers, something like that, you may not have much.
Thank you. Do you find other extension agents in the South that also built the demonstration barns? Mr. Greer's barn, he used as a demonstration barn. Do you find that in other places as well?
So I haven't looked at you'd have to look. I haven't done other state studies other than South Carolina. In South Carolina, there was a demonstration house built by the Black home demonstration agents with external funding. And so it would be like, this is what a modern farmhouse would look like. And so women would get to come and stay there, I think, for like a week and, you know, see things like, you know, indoor, like washers and dryers and stuff like that. I don't know of anything like a demonstration barn, but in South Carolina, I don't know. I can look at that, Dee Dee, and I can see you the information on it. There was a whole like brochure in the USDA on the demonstration house, but I don't know. I really I can't think of anything. I don't recall ever reading anything in a report about something like that. So, but it's possible. I mean, one of the things you find about these agents is that they use very creative ways to try to reach farmers, many of whom, if they were adult African Americans, they probably had less than an 8th grade education. And, you know, for most of this time, so they're working with people who are largely unlettered. And so visuals are going to be very important in how they decide whether this is a practice I want to be involved with.
Just, it's been brought up twice, and so I just want to make sure you know about it, Dr. Harris. Lizzie Jenkins worked with Conley Greer during demonstrations for the women in Albemarle County. So,
okay. Yeah, well, what I pulled off is all I found. It said Lizzie Jenkins this, and that's all I knew. And you do have that. I think she became like a state agent. I think I saw something before I came on here in another timeline that said she was a state agent, which means that you did not have a local agent in Albemarle. And what happened with that, because in each state eventually, even though Pierce and Campbell stayed in place, you would have a state agent for Negro extension work and state agent for Negro home demonstration work. And they would kind of be the point person at the state level for those agents out in the field. And oftentimes in counties without the service of an agent, they would be the ones, even though their job is supposed to be supervisory, they would go out to a county that didn't have that service and do hands-on demonstration. A lot of times they did that in the hope of persuading both the Black and white communities, the Black community to ask for it, the white community to put up the matching funds, the government put up the matching funds for it, that having this service would be beneficial. Now, there's another group called Jeans teachers, Jeans agricultural teachers. I don't know if you've heard of them. And a lot of times they don't put agents in counties. If you have a woman jeans teacher or a man jeans teacher in a county, they might not put an extension agent there and kind of expect that jeans teacher to fill in some of that activity.
Um, the next question is, from your experience in South Carolina and elsewhere, do you suppose that Mr. Greer was recruited as an agent or that he pursued the job on his own?
Well, the earliest agents I know of in South Carolina, those who worked under the General Education Board, they were farmers, and they were actually targeted because they were successful farmers, but they also had a reputation in the community that people would follow them. So the earliest agents, before we get to 1918 at least, are agents who are being hired for their hands-on expertise. Once you start getting into Smith Lever and you have these Black land-grant colleges turning out either agricultural degrees or home economics degrees, those jobs become places where those alumni land. And so they start, especially the agricultural schools. So if he was at an agricultural school, he could have gotten a job that way by just being a student at a state-funded land-grant institution. And they said, oh, we're good, he's well respected on campus, we're going to send him here. And probably they did come from farming families, but farming families who could afford for their sons or daughters to go to college. So it came to be a point where your way of getting the job is not to be a good farmer, but to go to a land-grant college.
Just to go back to a discussion about Mr. Butler, Mr. Butler went into a segregated service, but then headed the service when it was integrated. So
yeah, that happened to a lot of people. There were agents in South Carolina who began work during segregation, but they were young enough that eventually in integration, there came a time or an opportunity for them to lead. But in that transitional period from segregation to integration, you typically did not have that. If you had that multiracial workforce. So let me explain. I'll just use South Carolina as my thing. So this is how it happened. You had in a county your Black agents over wherever they were doing their thing, probably located offices in the Black community, the white agents over here. Step one, bring everybody together. They closed the Black office, so now everybody has to go to wherever the white office is for help. Typically in that first step, when nobody yet is fired, because they don't fire people, they don't clear people out, you're going to have the white agent be the county agricultural agent, the white woman be the county home demonstration agent, and any Blacks are going to be the assistant or associate under their supervision in that first strike. A lot of these Black agents who've been on that job a long time are going to end up retiring. Eventually, and like I said, the earliest one here, and you might want to check Mr. Butler's date for this, but eventually, and it took till 1970, at least in South Carolina, before the first Black person got appointed to be the senior county agent. So if Mr. Butler is that agent, becomes the agent for the county, and he's not agent until like 1972, that means probably a white person had to retire for him to get that job. If he got it between 64 and 70, the same thing could have happened. But what you want to look at is if you can find a roster from about 66 or so and see who's on that roster, then that would tell you. It is possible that he could come to be that person, but he may not start out as that person.
oh, okay. The next question is, you mentioned that the Boys and Girls Club of the early 1900s eventually became 4-H. Could you comment on how 4-H developed and included the African-American community? Did 4-H come about alongside as Extension Service grew, or was it a separate process?
Okay, it was a separate process, and it actually kind of began before Extension work. Okay, so you had those few demonstrators, but it actually kind of began before that, and they were just these clubs with what the objective was, what was the project: tomato club, corn club, cattle club, hog club, or whatever. Those clubs were how they were identified at first, and then about 1918. That's when they came up with the 4-H model. There's actually a website that's devoted to that. I did write an article about the integration of 4-H camps. Susie probably has that on my CV, and that's published, where I talk about this history of how it develops. There were some people who didn't want there to be integration, and Black Kids 4-H was called Negro 4-H Club. So every time they were even having the same thing, you had to put Negro in front of the Black part so everybody would know, it's different from the other. So it's separated. And a lot of the opportunities they had for white children in 4-H, you didn't have for Black children. Like some of the contests, they didn't have national camping until 1954. I think in 1950s, which is what that article that I was telling you that I wrote is about. So they were always there. But the thing you have to understand is that these are parallel kind of organizations. They're not funded equally. The Black ones are always seen as ancillary or auxiliary to the white ones. But these clubs did not grow out of extension work. It was one of those strategies that they were using early on. And, Seaman Knapp came up with part of this, thinking that if we do this, we can reach the parents. So it was, and it's I think too, there are earlier things, like if you look at Chautauquas and stuff like that in the 19th century, it has all kinds of roots where they kind of crystallize in these little organizations in the early 1900s.
Thank you for that information, Dr. Harris. I'm going to stop the questions there out of respect for your time and everyone else's time. And, this has been such an amazing talk. And if anyone wants these articles, I
can send you some links to some of them, because a lot of them are actually out on the internet.
And I have downloaded several of them to add to our interpretation for training at our site. So I can also send those to you all if you all want them.
Well, thank y'all for having me so much. I was afraid, but then once I got wound up, I couldn't stop talking.
Yeah, it was amazing. And thank you so much. It was informative. I'd like to thank our audience for spending time with us this evening. I hope that you all enjoyed it and learned a lot. If you haven't visited Ivy Creek Natural Area and Historic Riverview Farm, I hope that you will do so in the future. We will have our first Ivy Talk of 2023 on January 12th at 6:30. Professor Callan Bentley will be discussing Ivy Creek's record of deep time, the geological history of the Charlottesville region. You can sign up for that event just like you did for this one on our website. As always, that talk is free and open to the public. If you enjoyed this talk and would like to support what we do for our community, please consider going to our website and becoming a donor. And other than that, thank you all for joining us, and happy holidays, everyone.
Bye-bye.